They agree with it. And they possibly are right to agree with it in terms of their own experiences and their own frustrations. But as long as that is a pervasive feeling within a political culture, you may as well not have the paraphernalia and the furniture of democratic institutions. So to conclude, am I saying as a result of any of this, it's flawed, it's not democratic, we should give up? I don't think we should give up. I believe that the most important thing to do in a situation like this is to act as a democrat, and to act as if democracy is a possibility and an entitlement. To force out of the rhetoric, out of the institutions, and out of the limited spaces that exist within contemporary politics, to force opportunities to exist for real voices to be heard, for real debates to take place. Now, I would argue, and there's a long academic argument about this, and I haven't time to cover it here, that the internet does provide a space for that to happen. That there are opportunities within this new, relatively unregulated, relatively uncolonised space for people to take collective action and to form networks of connection and animation that can bring about changes that make a real difference. But I would argue that in addition to looking at that, we should be looking at what I would call the politics of intrusion. The politics of intrusion is based on the assumption that you start to talk about those issues that nobody expects you to talk about. You start to enter those meetings that nobody expects you to enter. You start to raise the kind of questions that are deeply discomforting to those who assume stability around acquiescence. And it seems to me that that cultural pressure of a growing group of people committed to an entitlement to democracy, imaginative designs for democracy, and opportunities to push the institutions we have, which can incidentally be pushed, to an enormous extent to provide for the kind of rights and privileges that they don't really want to offer. That, it seems to me, in the current position of a very depressed and demoralised population, is the strategic response to the vast chasm between the claims of democracy rhetorically and the realities of politics on the ground. Thanks.
Hello. Thanks to James, first of all, for inviting me up here and organising the trip. I was asked to reflect on three questions. What are the characteristics and ideas of democracy, is the first. The second, in the light of this understanding, to what extent are these ideals evident in modern society? And third, if there is a gap between these ideals and reality, how do we begin to bridge this gap between the two? Do we want to bridge this gap? And if not, what are the alternatives? Okay, and I was asked to reflect on this from an anarchist point of view, since a lot of my time is spent thinking about anarchism. So to answer the questions, all in 15 minutes, what I thought I'd do is present two different views of democracy, anarchist critiques, if you like, of democracy, and then come back to the questions at the end. Now, the first view is it's not specific to anarchism, it's generic to a lot of socialist thought. And this is the view that democracy is a sham because it's posited on a fundamental inequality which results from exploitation. So the institutions of liberal democracy might grant us formal equality, and this is the equality, of course, that the 19th century people struggled for, and for the rights of citizenship. But the argument is these fundamental economic inequalities are reflected back in the decision-making structures. So effectively, although you have a right to vote, you can't actually influence much of what goes on in the real world. Okay, now the difference between the anarchist take on this position and the Marxist take on this view is that anarchists don't subscribe to the idea that the political institutions that we have are necessarily or inextricably linked to the economic relations or the class relations which help structure them. Okay, that was the argument between the anarchists and the Marxists. But basically, most socialists had this view that democracy, liberal democracy, was a sham, and that democracy would forever remain a sham for as long as you had capitalism. Okay, now the second view, which I think was pushed within socialist thought, particularly by anarchists, but it's shared with some liberals, is that democracy implies a suspension of individual reason or conscience. And the idea here is that individuals in democracy can be coerced to accept decisions they don't agree with simply because the decision-making process has been open and fair. Okay, so this is a critique of majoritarianism. Equally, another way it sort of plays out is that individuals are obliged to accept collective decisions because individual interests are necessarily trumped by considerations of the common good. Okay, so this is a kind of Republican position that's identified with people like Rousseau and was attacked in the 19th century by anarchists like Proudhon and Bakunin. Okay, and in the past, anarchists have developed this kind of critique, particularly in respect of political parties, and they've pointed out that it leads to accepting notions of censorship or of purge or of self-censorship, either in fear of purge or because individuals are mistakenly persuaded that they can't make their own judgments and that the collectivity knows best. Okay, now in recent work, and I'm thinking particularly of Uri Gordon's book, it's a book called Anarchy Alive, this argument informs a critique of obligation as such. So his critique of democracy is that democracy must be rejected because it involves binding commitment, and that is its fundamental problem. Okay, now I'm going to read a quote from his book, Anarchy Alive. Uri Gordon argues, democratic discourse assumes without exception that the political process results at some point in collectively binding decision. Binding means enforceable, and enforceability is a background assumption of democracy. But the outcomes of anarchist process are inherently impossible to enforce. That is why the process is not democratic at all, since in democracy the point of equal participation in determining decisions is that this is what legitimizes these decisions' subsequent enforcement. Anarchism, then, represents not the most radical form of democracy, but an altogether different paradigm of collective action. Right? So basically he's arguing that if you're an anarchist, you're not a democrat. Okay. Both answers, it seems to me, point to a gap between an ideal and a reality. But in the first, the critique that democracy is simply illusory because it's based on exploitation, this critique allows for the possibility of a non-exploitative form of democratic decision-making. Okay, and this is what Uri Gordon dismisses as radical democracy. The second